In a quiet corner of Georgian England, where reputations were currency and a single ill-judged word could unravel a family's future, one woman watched everything and wrote it all down. Welcome back to Ocean of Tales. Today, we will be diving into the works of Jane Austen. She was born in 1775 in a small village called Steventon, the seventh of 8 children in a clergyman's family. She never traveled far. She never married. She wrote most of her major work at a small table in the family home, often putting the pages away quickly if a visitor walked in, since writing novels was not considered a particularly respectable occupation for a woman of her class. Her first novel was published anonymously, credited only to a lady. For most of her life, almost no one outside her immediate family knew she was the author of the books everyone was reading. She died in 1817, at just 41 years old, having published 4 novels in her lifetime, and leaving 2 more to be released after her death. And yet, over 2 centuries later, her stories are still being read, still being adapted, still being argued about, in living rooms and lecture halls alike. 6 completed novels, 1 sharp, early novella. Together, they form one of the most quietly devastating bodies of work in the English language, because Austen's real subject was never just romance. It was power, money, survival, and the impossible tightrope women were forced to walk between the two, in a world where a woman without a husband or a fortune had almost no legal standing at all. Let's walk through her world, one book at a time. Lady Susan. We begin not with one of her famous 6, but with the work she wrote as a teenager, sharp enough to still sting today. Austen wrote it around 1794, when she was still a teenager herself, though it was not published until 1871, long after her death, and long after the rest of her work had already made her famous. Lady Susan is told entirely through letters, a style called the epistolary novel, which was popular in Austen's youth, and used by many writers of the period to give the impression that a reader was eavesdropping on private correspondence. At its center is the title character herself, a beautiful, recently widowed woman with a talent for manipulation that borders on artistry. She moves between households, deploying charm as a weapon, and treats the people around her, including her own daughter, as pieces on a board. This isn't the Austen most readers expect. There's no gentle irony here, no eventual softening. It's colder, funnier in a sharper way, and shows us a young writer testing just how far a villain could be allowed to go on the page, and how enjoyable it might be to watch her get away with it, at least for a while. Some scholars consider it a kind of workshop for the sharper edges that would later show up more quietly in her mature novels. Sense and Sensibility. Published in 1811, this was Austen's first novel to actually reach the public, and she paid for its printing herself, a common practice at the time for unproven authors, meaning she personally bore the financial risk if it failed to sell. It introduces a theme she'd return to again and again: what happens to women when the money disappears. When their father dies, the Dashwood sisters are left with very little, pushed out of their childhood home by the rules of inheritance, which in this period typically passed property to the nearest male relative rather than to daughters or widows. Elinor and Marian represent 2 different ways of facing the world, one guided by careful restraint, the other by open feeling. As they navigate new homes, new social circles, and the fragile business of finding suitable husbands, the novel quietly asks which approach actually protects a person better, a guarded heart or an open one. It's a story about grief, dwindling fortune, and the particular vulnerability of being a woman with no income of your own, wrapped in wit sharp enough that you might not notice how bleak the stakes really are. Austen had experienced something similar in her own life, since her family faced real financial uncertainty after her father's death, which likely shaped how precisely she understood the sisters' situation. Pride and Prejudice. If you know only one Jane Austen story, it's probably this one. Published in 1813, it began years earlier under a different title, First Impressions, before Austen reworked it into the novel we know today. It remains her most widely read and most frequently adapted work. Elizabeth Bennet is intelligent, quick-tongued, and entirely unimpressed by the wealthy, aloof Mr. Darcy when they first meet. He's not much more taken with her either, or so it seems. What follows is one of literature's great slow turns, two people forced to confront their own snap judgments, their own blind spots, and the ways pride and assumption can distort what's actually standing in front of you. Around them swirls a family of 5 daughters, a mother desperate to see them all married off, and a social world where a single rumor can ruin a reputation overnight. It's often read as a romance, and it is one, but it's also a study in how easily we mistake first impressions for truth, and how much work it takes to unlearn them. The novel's opening line, about a truth universally acknowledged, is one of the most quoted sentences in English literature, and sets up the entire book's project of examining what people assume about each other before they actually know anything at all. Mansfield Park. Published in 1814, this is Austen's longest novel, and by most readings, her most morally serious one. It sold well during her lifetime, though it has always divided readers more sharply than her other books. Fanny Price is sent as a child to live with wealthy relatives at Mansfield Park, where she grows up on the margins, grateful, watchful, and always aware of exactly where she stands in the household's pecking order. When a charismatic brother and sister arrive nearby, their charm begins to unsettle the household's careful order, and Fanny becomes one of the only people who seems to notice something is wrong beneath the surface. Unlike Austen's other heroines, Fanny doesn't dazzle. She observes, and the novel uses that quietness deliberately, asking readers to sit with a protagonist who has principle instead of sparkle, and to consider whether that's actually the harder, rarer thing to have. The novel also touches, more directly than her other books, on questions of wealth and where it actually comes from, since the family's fortune is tied to property overseas, a detail modern scholars have examined closely. Emma. Published in 1815, this was the last novel Austen saw into print during her own lifetime, and by then her identity as the author of her previous books was becoming something of an open secret in certain circles, even though her name still didn't appear on the title page. Emma Woodhouse is clever, comfortable, and utterly convinced of her own good judgment, particularly when it comes to arranging other people's romantic lives. Austen reportedly described her to a family member as a heroine whom the reader might not initially like very much, an unusually bold choice for the time. She takes it upon herself to guide a young friend toward what she believes is a suitable match, confident in her own matchmaking instincts. The trouble is, Emma is far better at reading situations than she is at reading herself. Misunderstandings pile up, assumptions crumble, and the small, enclosed world of her village turns out to have far more going on beneath its polite surface than she ever accounted for. It's one of Austen's funniest books, and also one of her most psychologically precise, a portrait of a woman who has to be humbled by her own mistakes before she can actually see clearly, including about herself. Many critics consider its narrative technique, which stays extremely close to Emma's own limited point of view, to be one of Austen's most sophisticated achievements. Northanger Abbey. Although published posthumously in 1817, this was actually one of the earliest novels Austen completed, written in the late 1790s, and sold to a publisher years before her death, who then sat on it and never printed it, forcing her to eventually buy back the rights herself. Catherine Morland is young, imaginative, and has read far too many Gothic novels, the kind filled with haunted castles, dark secrets, and villainous noblemen, a genre that was hugely popular with readers at the time. When she's invited to stay at a real English abbey, she can't help layering her novel-fed imagination over an ordinary household, convinced that something sinister must be lurking beneath its calm surface. It's Austen at her most playful, gently teasing the popular fiction of her day while still building a genuine coming-of-age story underneath the joke, about learning the difference between the dangers we imagine and the ones that actually deserve our attention. It also works as a kind of loving argument in defense of novels themselves, since Austen includes a passage directly addressing critics who dismissed novel reading as frivolous, particularly for young women. Persuasion. Also published posthumously in 1817, this was the last novel Austen completed, finished only months before her death, and it carries a different weight than her earlier work because of that. Austen's final completed novel is also her most autumnal, a story about second chances, written with the quiet ache of someone who understands regret. Anne Elliot once let herself be talked out of a match with a man she loved, persuaded that it wasn't a wise enough decision. Years later, older and quieter, she finds herself back in his orbit, watching him from a distance she can't quite close. The novel moves slower and sits heavier than Austen's earlier work, asking what it costs to follow good advice when it leads you away from the one thing you actually wanted. There's less comedy here, and more stillness. It feels, in many ways, like the work of a writer looking back with clearer eyes, which makes sense, since Austen wrote it in the final year of her life, already dealing with the illness that would eventually kill her. 7 stories, written across barely more than 2 decades, by a woman who spent most of her life in a handful of small English towns, and who never lived to see just how far her reputation would eventually travel. One recurring question, asked from every possible angle, in a world that gave women so little control over their own lives: how do you still find a way to choose your own judgment, your own partner, your own path? Jane Austen never raised her voice to ask it. She didn't need to. 200 years on, we're still listening for the answer. That's it for today's episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to Ocean of Tales so that you never miss one. Ocean of Tales. Goodbye for now.